Two trucks, same decade, same mission, survive the worst terrain on the planet. One wears a German star, the other wears a blue oval. Here's the question nobody's really answered. Why did a luxury car company that had never built anything like this before suddenly decide, in the middle of the 1970s, it needed to go head-to-head with America's toughest off-roaders? Was this really about serving farmers and diplomats? Or was Mercedes quietly building something to answer the Ford Bronco on its own turf? Stick around, because the real story, the engineering, the failures, the humiliations, and a rivalry that's still going on today, is stranger than the marketing version ever let on. This is the true history of the Mercedes G-Class. Rewind to 1973. Why would Daimler-Benz, a company that made sedans for bankers and diplomats, suddenly need a serious off-roader? The answer isn't a visionary light bulb moment. It's a problem. Somebody else's problem. Steyr Daimler Puch, Mercedes' Austrian partner, was in trouble. They'd just killed off their compact off-roader, the Haflinger, and replaced it with something called the Pinzgauer. Arguably one of the most capable off-road vehicles ever engineered, but too complicated and too expensive to fill the hole the Haflinger left behind. Steyr didn't have the money or the factory space to run two off-road programs at once, and without a compact model in the lineup, they were bleeding a customer base they couldn't afford to lose. So the chairman of Daimler-Benz turns to his engineers and says, essentially, we've got a partnership deal with Steyr. Figure something out. That's the entire founding memo, straight from Mercedes' own company records. No secret desert prototype for a foreign monarch, no dramatic garage story passed down through generations of engineers. Just one company's crisis, becoming another company's opportunity. Mercedes got a foothold in a market it had never touched. Steyr got a successor for its dying off-roader, and the project even got a working code name, H2, Haflinger 2. Nothing in that official record ever mentions Ford or the Bronco by name. But it's hard not to notice that this was the exact same rugged, go-anywhere market Ford had already been dominating stateside since 1966. Whether that crossed anyone's mind in Stuttgart is something we'll probably never know for sure. But here's what that boardroom memo doesn't tell you. The truck the German engineers actually started sketching had almost nothing to do with a simple Haflinger replacement. Mercedes wanted something way more ambitious, a vehicle that could take on the worst terrain on Earth, but drive like a Mercedes the second it hit pavement. Off-roaders in the 70s were tools you tolerated, not vehicles you actually wanted to drive on the highway. Mercedes wanted to be the first to break that rule. And because this was Mercedes, not a scrappy startup, there was zero appetite for exotic engineering. The rule was simple: raid the parts bin. Reuse as much from existing Mercedes models as you could get away with and keep the whole thing economically sane. You can see that thinking in the drivetrain. 4 engine options at launch. A gas 4-cylinder making 102 horsepower. A diesel 4-cylinder that only managed a modest 72 and 2 more on the way. A 5-cylinder diesel and a fuel-injected inline-6 borrowed from the sedan lineup and detuned for off-road duty. Then there was a 5th option nobody expected. An air-cooled 4-cylinder borrowed straight from the Austrian Pinzgauer, built specifically for militaries that wanted parts commonality across their existing fleets. Why bother with 5 different engines for one truck? Because Mercedes wasn't just building an off-roader, they were building a modular family. One platform meant to become an ambulance, a fire truck, a motorhome, or a soft top for a weekend hunting trip, depending on which customer was writing the check. Compare that to the Bronco's approach back home. One straightforward body, a simple inline-6 or V8, built rugged and left simple on purpose. 2 completely different philosophies solving the same problem. Ford went simple and scalable. Mercedes went modular and complicated on purpose. The transmission followed the German logic too, a fully synchronized 4-speed manual, nearly identical to a regular Mercedes sedans. But the transfer case was pure Steyr engineering, and here's why it actually mattered. It did 2 jobs, engaging the front axle and dropping you into a low-range crawl ratio for technical terrain. And thanks to those synchronizers, you could shift into 4-wheel drive or low range on the move. No stopping, no climbing out to lock hubs by hand. Most rivals of that era made you get out of the truck to engage four-wheel drive manually, kneeling in the mud to twist a lock on each front hub. The Mercedes let you do it with a dip of the clutch or a flick of the automatic into neutral. That's the kind of detail that never shows up in a brochure, but absolutely shows up the first time you're stuck axle deep with the engine still running. Full-time all-wheel drive, the kind Range Rover was running, got tossed out early. Too much drivetrain loss on regular roads, and Mercedes wanted this thing efficient enough for a daily commute, not just weekend expeditions. Differential locks were available, but only as a paid option on certain trims. There was even early talk of a rear-wheel drive-only base model for buyers who just wanted the toughness and the styling without the full off-road package. Solid axles, borrowed from Mercedes' own commercial trucks, bolted to a ladder frame built from 4mm steel. Thick enough to shrug off rust and abuse for decades. Why go old school when independent suspension already existed elsewhere? Because solid axles meant predictable ground clearance no matter the load, and zero driveshaft headaches under heavy articulation on rough terrain, where a broken shaft could end a trip 1,000 miles from the nearest dealer. The payoff. A chassis that could survive punishment nothing else in this segment could take, and one platform flexible enough to spawn 2 wheelbases and half a dozen body styles, from a bare-bones soft top to a fully enclosed 4-door wagon. And the body. Flat panels, sharp edges, deliberately zero fancy stamping. Why? Because a fender crushed in the field needed to be something a small-town mechanic could hammer out a replacement for, not something requiring a factory tool and a 6-week parts wait. Even the narrow width wasn't an accident. Narrower trucks get stuck less often, and militaries had very specific width requirements that never made it into the glossy brochures. The payoff of all that restraint. A truck that looked plain sitting in a showroom, but that made complete sense the moment you saw it squeeze through a gap nothing else in its class could fit through. Before it ever reached a dealership, Mercedes tortured this thing. Deserts, mountains, salt flats, and full-running chassis dunked into mud baths, engine on, gear engaged, violently shaken by hydraulic pulsators to compress years of abuse into a few brutal hours. Every seal, every joint had to survive that ordeal before a single customer ever got behind the wheel. Production started February 1979 in Graz, Austria. 800 workers, a target of 11,000 trucks a year. And then came the number that made headlines. Over 40,000 Deutschmarks for a loaded diesel. Pricier than a Mercedes S-Class, with the 2.8-litre 6 under its hood, and nearly double the price of the cheapest sedan in the entire Mercedes lineup. Power steering, which you basically needed to drive this thing without exhausting yourself, cost extra. Each differential lock cost extra. On the short wheelbase, soft top, even the rear seat was optional. Inside, hard black plastic that critics were already slamming in Mercedes regular sedans, no central locking at any price. Meaning you walked around and checked all 5 doors by hand, every single time. No rear defroster, and a foot pump windshield washer so weak a hard stomp barely dribbled 2 thin streams onto the glass. But the visibility was outstanding. Big glass, square corners you could actually judge from the driver's seat. And that narrow body paid off constantly, over 3 inches narrower than a Range Rover and more than 7 inches narrower than a Chevy Blazer, which meant it slipped through gaps on the trail that stopped wider rivals cold. So why did anybody actually buy this thing? Because the second you drove it, every one of those complaints disappeared. Nothing else on the market combined this kind of on-road composure with this kind of off-road ability. Testers eventually got one stuck, but only by calling in an actual farmer with a tractor. In the real world, mud, snow, sand, and steep terrain barely slowed it down, and that little diesel turned out to be a torque monster too. Rival gas engines were burning over 30 liters per 100 kilometers off-road, while this thing, hauling over 2 tons, stayed under 20. And here's the part that really separated it from everything else on the market at the time: the handling. Most off-roaders of that era turned high-speed driving into a genuine white-knuckle event, especially on rough pavement. Not this one. rock solid in a straight line, even at highway speed, precise steering, grip that took no more effort than a regular sedan. In corners, this tall, heavy box refused to act like a tall, heavy box. Mild, predictable understeer, minimal body roll, and zero surprises even at the absolute limit. Lift off the throttle mid-corner, and it just settled right back down instead of snapping on you, whether it was in two-wheel drive or four. That's the exact brief Mercedes set out to hit. Serious off-road ability without sacrificing the manners of a road car. A combination that, up to that point, simply hadn't existed in this class of vehicle. In 1980, German magazine Auto, Motor und Sport threw it into the ring with the real competition, and each truck in that lineup had its own personality. The Jeep CJ was raw and primitive, genuinely terrifying at the limit, with inside wheels lifting off the ground in hard corners and brakes that faded fast after a few hard stops. The Land Rover was rugged but exhausting. Heavy, unassisted steering, a clutch that fought you every stroke, constant correction just to hold a straight line on the highway. The Toyota Land Cruiser was capable but brutally harsh, testers half joking that it didn't seem to have a suspension in any conventional sense, hammering passengers with impacts that made every mile feel like a fight. The little Volkswagen Iltis was the scrappy underdog, bouncing around like it was trying to launch all four wheels off the ground at once before slamming back down. The humble Lada Niva, against all odds, drove like an actual car. And the Mercedes? Road manners and extreme off-road capability in one package. Something none of its rivals had managed to combine. Testers half-joked it drove like it came from a different planet entirely. Off-road, only the Mercedes and that scrappy Volkswagen were still moving once everyone else had already given up. Hung up diagonally with wheels spinning uselessly in the air while the Mercedes just clicked its diff locks in and kept crawling forward. Meanwhile, back in America, Ford's Bronco was fighting this exact same fight. Simple, tough, and never once entering a European test like this one, because it didn't need to. It already had its own continent to win, and that scorecard mattered beyond bragging rights. This new wave of tough, road-mannered off-roaders was landing a real punch on Range Rover and British Leyland, who'd owned the prestige off-roader lane for years without any serious competition. Suddenly, hunters, ranchers, and anyone who wanted something rugged that didn't look out of place outside a dinner party had a legitimate alternative. A few years later came the real title fight. Not Ford this time, Range Rover. Because Bronco was one philosophy, and Mercedes was another. But the true challenge to prestige off-roading came from Britain. The headline said it all. Officer and a gentleman. Climb into the Mercedes, and you knew exactly what you were sitting in. A workstation, function over everything, every switch built to outlive you. Seats that looked like they'd never wear out or sag or age a day. There was almost too much seriousness in that cabin, like it had been designed by mechanics for mechanics. Climb into the Range Rover, and you got velvet upholstery, real carpet on the floor, and gorgeous wood trim. The kind of cabin where you'd bag your muddy boots in plastic before daring to sit down in clean shoes. The Range Rover's American-born V8 pulled harder and smoother from idle, making it noticeably quicker despite less horsepower on paper than the Mercedes twin-cam 6. A 6 that needed real revs to come alive and felt gutless below 3,000 revolutions per minute, which begged the obvious question, why no V8 in the German truck at all? But off-road, the tables flipped completely. The Range Rover stayed shockingly composed thanks to serious suspension travel. The Mercedes rode stiffer and sent more of the terrain straight into your spine. But there was almost nothing that could actually stop it once those diff locks clicked in. If you genuinely wanted to find a vehicle's true off-road limits, the answer was the Mercedes, hands down. The Range Rover was the most elegant way in the world to drive an off-roader. It just was never built to be pushed that hard. Through the rest of the 80s, the G-Wagen kept quietly evolving. A new 5-cylinder diesel, a standard 5-speed gearbox, power steering finally included instead of a costly option, brake wear indicators, heated washer nozzles, standard fog lights. And with every upgrade, the price crept higher and higher. Then, 1989 hit, and for the first time in this truck's entire life, the legend started losing. Mercedes put its flagship up against a new wave. The Jeep Cherokee, the Mitsubishi Pajero, the Nissan Terrano. That aging twin-cam 6, long discontinued in Mercedes-owned sedans, needed to be revved hard just to keep pace, while the newer truck's V6 engines pulled strong from idle. Nearly 20 seconds to 60 miles an hour, dead last in the group, while the Cherokee did it in under 11. Top speed, fuel economy, maneuverability. The Mercedes lost on almost every single measurable spec, despite having the smallest engine displacement in the whole test, working overtime just to move its own weight. And fully loaded, it cost nearly 60% more than a comparable Pajero. Was this it? Was the truck that once schooled a Range Rover finally becoming obsolete? 10 years too late to keep up with a generation of Japanese rivals built specifically to beat it? But every single tester had to admit the same thing. Off-road, none of that mattered. The dynamics were still safe and predictable, the build quality was still bulletproof, and while it wasn't winning as an all-around vehicle anymore, as a dedicated off-road tool, nothing could touch it. It was never trying to be a lifestyle vehicle, never trying to compete on smoothness or refinement. It was still built by professionals, for professionals. The kind of truck you bought because you actually needed it to work, not because it looked good doing the school run. So after more than a decade running on the original formula, was Mercedes finally ready to move on? Everyone in the industry already knew the answer. A new 6-cylinder, full-time 4-wheel drive, and a dashboard borrowed from the modern W124 sedan were waiting for a 1990 relaunch, the W460. But the original truck didn't just quietly disappear. It kept rolling off the line right alongside its replacement until 1992, refusing to be rushed off the stage, before finally handing off to a stripped-down military successor built for soldiers and government fleets. Exactly the way this whole story began. And here's the payoff to the question we opened with. That rivalry with America never actually ended, it just changed shape. Fast forward to today, and the G-Class's most talked about rival for that same rugged, go-anywhere crowd isn't a Land Rover or a Range Rover anymore. It's the new Ford Bronco. Same argument, different decade. American toughness and value versus German over-engineering and prestige. This is exactly why we opened with those two trucks. Different badge, same fight. This whole story started with back in 1979. From a boardroom crisis in 1973, to a mud bath torture test, to humiliating a Range Rover off-road, to nearly losing its own crown in 1989 and clawing it back on pure off-road ability alone. That's the real origin of the G-Class. Not a luxury icon from day one. A tool. Overbuilt, over-engineered, and stubbornly loyal to a mission it was never designed to abandon. Get you there, no matter what. No matter how much it cost you, no matter how many complaints it made your eyes water reading. Every leather seat and 6-figure price tag that came later? That's a different story entirely. This one is about the machine that earned the right to become a legend in the first place. So here's the real question this whole video was built around. Was the G-Class ever really just another off-roader? Or was Mercedes quietly building something meant to answer America the entire time? You tell me. Team Mercedes or Team Ford? Drop it in the comments.